80% of all illness is either caused or exacerbated by stress.
You can lie about your money, you can have Ferraris on loan for the day, but you can't lie about health and fitness.
Hippocrates was right. All disease begins in the gut.
Without a shared purpose, without a shared vision, all unions will fray.
Exhaustion, cynicism, and ineffectiveness, that's the definition of burnout.
The average American is eating food for 16 hours a day.
We separate business and health as two separate things. And I'm saying they're not. They're one thing.
We have to come to where we can find agreement.
One of the most common things I'll hear from patients who try the dopamine fast is,
That sounds intimidating, and it is for most people.
Especially in the modern world where we are addicted to, like you say, processes, behaviors, stimuli, even means of communication itself can become that which we can be addicted to. It's not like, 200 years ago, people weren't addicted to having conversations.
right.
But now in a sense they can be,
Yes.
right? So given that it's a blurred line now, how do you actually define addiction?
Yeah, great question. So broadly speaking, addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and or others.
So harm is a condition of addiction.
Yeah, broadly speaking, that's kind of the bedrock of the disorder. When we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there are 11 criteria that are captured in this disorder that we call a substance use disorder or a process disorder, or an addiction. Addiction is a more commonly understood term, although the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, doesn't actually use that term. But I use that term addiction synonymous with substance use disorders.
Okay.
And there are 11 criteria. And the more criteria that you meet, then the more addicted you are. So typically you have to have a minimum of 2 criteria to meet the threshold for addiction. And, it goes up from there to give you a mild, moderate, or severe kind of diagnosis. So as you can see, it's very subjective and feels very, unsatisfying and not scientific in that sense. And yet that's exactly how we diagnose every psychiatric disorder. So there's no brain scan or blood test for any psychiatric disorder. The brain is still very much a black box. We understand a lot more than we did 100 years ago, but still, when we make a psychiatric diagnosis, we are basing it on that person's behaviors, what we observe in them, what the people around them observe, and what they subjectively endorse. So the criteria from the DSM for an addiction can broadly be summarized as the 4 C's: controls, compulsions, cravings, and consequences. Out of control use is planning to use a certain amount and using way more than that. Compulsive use is a lot of mental real estate occupied with thinking about using, hiding use, and also a level of automaticity related to the use. Cravings is intrusive thoughts about using that come unbidden, as well as the physiologic urges to use that are very powerful. And then finally, consequences are related to all of the various life consequences that can occur when people become addicted. So those are sort of a summary of the 11 criteria. There are some physiologic criteria, things like withdrawal is one of the criteria, and also tolerance. Tolerance means needing more of a substance over time to get the same effect.
So I want to ask you, what would you say is what does a minimally dopamine addicted person look like, assuming social media, let's just use social media as kind of the drug of choice. For somebody that's minimally addicted to dopamine stimulation, that probably doesn't even think of themselves in those terms, how would you describe that behaviorally and sort of practically?
I think the way to think about this is, and this is also the way that I kind of think about it with my patients, in the room, is to think about that substance or that behavior that you have a conflicted relationship with. And actually, you've characterized that exactly in terms of your love-hate relationship with social media. So a behavior that you're drawn to, that you will kind of do as almost a default mode network, where you will just, it's sort of the thing that you do when you're tired, when you're stressed, to have fun, to escape. And importantly, that you find that you are unhappy with the way you consume that substance or behavior, either because you use too much or you use too often, or it's interfering with your goals or interfering with your values. People you love and care about are commenting that you're often distracted or checked out or otherwise impaired because of that behavior. So I think if we stop and really ask ourselves, then many of us can identify at least one thing in our lives that we don't necessarily want to stop entirely, but that we want to use differently. The other thing that I think is a subtle sign of worry, but I find it to be very helpful to think about, is that substance or that behavior that we're lying about. And it might be just a matter of degree. Like, it's not that we're lying about consuming it, but we're lying about how much, how often, in what circumstances, exactly what the substance was, which is why one of the things I talk about in my book is the importance of radical honesty, where we're really intentionally focused on telling the truth, not just about our consumption, but really all of our behaviors, as a way to keep ourselves accountable so that we don't get lost in this realm of what we call in the addiction business denial, where we're actually ultimately then lying to ourselves. And one of the ways to do that, to be radically honest and really be more aware about our consumption, is to focus on it, right? And really look at it and really document it. Because the truth is that when we're chasing dopamine, it's very easy to lose track, and that most of us will greatly minimize our consumption of that substance or behavior that's potentially addictive and that we have that conflicted relationship with. And just to give you a very recent example in my own life, my daughter came up to me about a month ago and said, "Mom, you're always watching YouTube now." And obviously, as somebody who's very vigilant about these sorts of things and think that I'm doing a pretty good job, I got very defensive. I said, "I'm not always watching YouTube." She goes, "Yeah, you are. Almost every time I come up to you now and you're on your computer, you're watching YouTube." I said, "I am not watching YouTube." And then I proceeded to justify what I was watching, which was some kind of sporting event related to my daughter's athletics. But when she walked away from me, I just took an extra moment. I thought, is she right? Am I watching a lot of YouTube? Let me stop and think about it. And a good way to do this is something called the timeline Fallback method, where instead of thinking in a vague way about what we've been consuming, we actually take it a day at a time, going backwards from the current day. So you say to yourself, okay, I've been on YouTube for half an hour today, right after my daughter walked away. Well, how much YouTube did I watch yesterday? Well, I came home from work. I probably turned it on about 6 p.m. and I probably watched about 2 hours. Okay, so that was 2 hours yesterday, the day before that. And you keep going like that until you've figured out how much you've consumed in a week. And that can often be revelatory, because then it's like, oh, I've watched 20 hours of YouTube this week. So what felt to me like a half an hour here and a half an hour there turned out to be, like almost a day of YouTube, right? And then when I was willing to look at that and really see it, I was then motivated to change that behavior. Now, that's not always going to be the case. People who are severely addicted can see their consumption, be really motivated to change, and still not be able to change without help. But for someone like me who's a little bit addicted to a lot of different things, just that exercise allowed me to say, okay, I'm going to make the commitment to do a fast, or what I call a dopamine fast, which is one of the major early interventions that I recommend, where I'm not going to watch YouTube for a month. And I'm on like week 3 or so, maybe week 4 of that. I'm not tracking that too closely. But that's a really useful intervention, because it's also an opportunity to see just how addicted we've become, right? Like, just how hard is it to give up that particular website or that particular form of social media or what have you.
Even if your addiction isn't, quote, destroying your life, it still could be destroying the life that you could have if you were using that time to do better things.
So there is this sort of notion, which I think is a false notion, which is, if you have like all this great stuff in your life, and I'm not just talking material stuff, but I'm talking the great stuff of life that comes for free, but it's hard to find, then you would never get addicted. And that is not true. And it's especially not true in the world that we live in today, where everything has become drugified and is made more accessible, more abundant, more potent, more novel, more reinforcing releases, more dopamine. And what happens in the brain as we get into this cycle of compulsive overconsumption, we actually change our brains and decrease our motivation to engage in these other activities. One of the most common things I'll hear from patients who try the dopamine fast and get away from their drug for a month, and the reason I recommend a month is for people who are, especially people who are more severely addicted, a month is about a minimum amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways and reset dopamine thresholds. And that's really important and to be able to get access to other more modest natural rewards. But one of the most common themes I'll hear for people who actually make it is, I am so much more motivated than I was before, and I'm getting so much more done than I was before. And as a result of that, I'm feeling so much better about myself. So my point being is, you've sort of made a certain proposition, which I think is partially true, which is, if you have a flourishing life and self-esteem and all these other, psychological benefits, then you are less likely to get addicted. Or if you start to go down that road, it's easier to come out of it. But what I'm trying to communicate is that even when you have all of those things, we can very easily go down this road, and then these things diminish. They become less relevant. They recede. They're in the rearview mirror, and we lose our perspective on them, and we lose our motivation to engage in those activities.
Why is it that a dopamine from a Instagram is different than dopamine from feeding the homeless?
Great. Okay. So we are wired over millions of years of evolution to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And we do that reflexively without thinking. And it's what's allowed us to survive and thrive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is the world that we have lived in for almost all of human existence, say for the last 200 to 500 years. So the way that our brain gets us to approach the kinds of rewards that will keep us alive, what we call natural rewards, food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate, is by releasing a little bit of dopamine in a specific circuit in the brain called the reward pathway. And by the way, dopamine is the final common pathway from many other neurotransmitters and hormones, things like our own endogenous opioids that we make in our brain, not from ingesting our own endogenous cannabinoids. We make our own cannabis, right? Our own serotonin, norepinephrine, oxytocin. It's all a big soup in there. But the final common sort of ka-ching is the dopamine that gets released in that very specific reward pathway. And that tells us, ooh, that was a good thing. You need to do that again and again and again. But when we're living in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, we have to work very, very hard and wait a long time and get lucky to find that reward. Now you take that ancient circuitry, right, that is perfectly adapted to this world of scarcity. You're on this, you're on the desert. You've walked for 20 kilometers. You're hungry. You're thirsty. You're alone. You see an oasis. You see another person, like bing, 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 bing. Yeah, it's awesome. But you take that circuitry and you transplant it to the modern day, where at the tip of a finger, we have instant access with no a priori work or effort needed to be put into that.
No pain.
No pain. Okay. No pain. And not only that, the amount of dopamine that is released with modern drugs is enormous. It's like a fire hose.
And when you say modern drugs, are you only speaking about pharmaceuticals, or are you speaking about all these drugified things in our society? Social
media, video games, Twitter, online gambling, online pornography, and hookup sites, food in the modern world full of processed starches, sugars, salt. It's all of it. I mean, almost every human behavior form of human consumption has now been turned into a drug. So that means, what are those 4 features that make it different from, what our brain is actually adapted for? It's more plentiful, right? We don't run out of TikTok, right? You might even run out of cocaine, but you're not going to run out of TikTok, right? It's more potent, right? So where we used to have to get our opioids from the opium poppy, so we had to cultivate a plot of land. We had to wait for it to grow. We had to tend to it every day. We had to harvest it. Then we got a little bit of sap that we could smoke. And that was, it had its utility. Mm-hmm. Now you've got fentanyl made cheaply in a laboratory without any opium poppy precursors, sold on the street, for pennies to the dollar. So you've got more potent forms. And by the way, the digital content is also incredibly potent, right? It goes right to the visual cortex, these moving images, these flashing lights, the enumeration, right? Where we're rankings, we're very susceptible to numbers, and we want to get our numbers closest to whatever the top is. You've got increased quantity, you've got increased potency, you've got increased access. Think about the smartphone and how that changed our lives. Now, running for the bus, you can be watching a movie, right? Totally different. And then finally, you've got increased novelty. And dopamine is very sensitive to novelty. That is to say, our brains naturally engage that treasure-seeking function where we're looking for the reward, right? And if we find a reward that's as good, but a little bit different from the last one, that's even more reinforcing. Because, we are wired for newness. We're wired for innovation. We're Mother Nature's ultimate strivers. And that's what you have with these digital products. The AI learns us, knows what we like, proffers something that's similar to what we've done before, but a little bit different. That's why people get addicted to the news. I have lots of people now coming in saying, I'm addicted to the news. Even though the news is horrible and people think it makes me feel terrible, they can't stop engaging because of the newness feature and the way in which novelty is something that we're wired to approach.
I love this line on your website that says, your book, Dopamine Nation, explains why the relentless pursuit of pleasure leads to pain.
Right.
Which you're now giving us. It's because there's so much pleasure out there and it's so plentiful, potent, accessible, and novel that you can stuff yourself with it in 5 seconds. And then the remainder of the 24 hours, you're just overstuffing yourself with it effectively, right?
Well, I think the key to understanding how the pursuit of pleasure leads to pain is to understand that pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance.
Right.
And one side is pleasure and one side is pain. And the overarching rule governing that balance is that it wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And the way that the brain restores a level balance after any deviation from neutrality is first by tipping an equal and opposite amount to the other side. So when we experience pleasure, the way that our brains get us back to the level position is first by tipping to the side of pain and then going level. That is really, really important. What's happening biochemically is that with an intoxicant, we're getting a sudden spike in dopamine release, followed immediately on its heels by dopamine free fall, not just to baseline firing levels of dopamine, because dopamine is always firing at a baseline level, but actually below baseline to this dopamine deficit state, which is pain. It's discomfort, it's dis-ease.
That's withdrawal.
Anxiety. It's withdrawal.
Right. Yeah.
And what's happening in the world now is that we're experiencing subtle forms of withdrawal all the time outside of conscious awareness. The other really important piece of that is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar stimulus, that initial response to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, less dopamine released, but the after response to pain gets stronger and longer. So we end up getting kind of that pleasure pain balance kind of stuck on the pain side, where we're in kind of a chronic dopamine deficit state. We've essentially reset our hedonic set point as a way to compensate for too much dopamine coming in. So that's really the key piece there. It's not just, that the world is oversaturated with these drugs in all these various forms. It's that the way that our brains adapt to that is actually downregulating our own dopamine transmission and production to this dopamine deficit state below baseline level, which is very similar to depression, anxiety. Yeah. I think the key piece here is that what happens in the addicted brain is that the individual is in a chronic dopamine deficit state, meaning that now they need their drug not to get high, but just to feel normal. And when they're not using their drug, they're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. The reason this is really important is because what happens as we become addicted is we are compulsively pursuing our drug in the total absence of joy. So what looks from the outside like that person has no willpower and is so selfish, why can't they just stop, is in that person's brain nothing like that at all, because the physiologic drive to restore homeostasis or a level balance is so overwhelming that most of us would go outside of our moral compass in order to do it, which means that once we're an addicted brain, our drug just looms so large in our lives because we're in withdrawal, right? We've got a pleasure pain balance tilted to the side of pain. Now we need to get that drug as a matter of survival, or at least that's what it feels like in a way. We cannot not reach for it in order to restore that level balance or restore homeostasis.
Good. I say good is the enemy of great. Like there's a lot of good things around that if you want to have the space to have a great life, you're going to have to get really good at saying no to, and then fill your life with a few disciplines and habits that move you toward the best possible life you can visualize yourself having, and then some, because it's actually achievable in the world if you'll change your habits. But to make all that work, I like to hold myself up as a credible example. I've sort of taken it upon myself to say, I'm going to be the guinea pig that proves. And so I'm going to get up really early, even though I don't have to. I'm going to work harder than anybody, even though I don't have a boss. I'm going to stay in really much better than needed shape just to prove that these you can be in your 40s and still in really good shape.
So, we talked about this pleasure pain balance and how with repeated pressing on the pleasure side, we eventually end up chronically tilted to the pain side. I like to imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it there. So they stay on, and with repeated exposures, you get enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. But what's very important to realize,
now the seesaw is just stuck at that.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Because the gremlins are camped out there. With enough abstinence from that drug of choice, the gremlins eventually hop off and homeostasis is restored. But what's also true is that the gremlins will happily hop on the pleasure side of the balance if we intentionally do things that are hard, either physically hard, emotionally hard, psychologically hard.
You just made my life make sense. Thank you. Woo.
But there's a caveat there. So let me finish. Okay. So for example, exercise is the most obvious example. It turns out exercise is actually toxic to cells. And when we press on the pain side of the balance with exercise, essentially what we're doing is we're triggering the body to say, oh, there's an injury here. It's time to upregulate our own healing and feel good hormones and neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. And that's represented by the gremlins then hopping on the pleasure side of the balance to ultimately bring it level again. In other words, we're paying for our dopamine upfront, right? By doing things that are hard, we activate the body's own re-regulating mechanisms to make dopamine to respond to that. And it's actually, there's a whole science called hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. And what we're
that's like intentional cold exposure and like shocks to the system.
Ice cold water baths, exercise in its myriad forms.
Some people eat really spicy food because it helps their metabolism.
Spicy food, exactly. Intermittent fasting from food, many other mind-body practices, exposure therapy, a creative and intellectually challenging endeavors. These are all things where we invest our labor and our intention, and it's hard. It's hard to do.
I love that you said you're paying now instead of paying later.
That's right.
Okay.
And if you think about it from a graphic point of view, if you imagine dopamine firing is represented on the graph as a line. With an intoxicant, what you get is a sudden spike of dopamine above baseline levels, followed by dopamine free fall below baseline into this dopamine deficit state. But what you get with hormesis, or intentionally inviting pain into your life, a kind of intentional asceticism, is you get, for example, with exercise, the data show a gradual rise in dopamine in the latter half of exercise, followed by elevated dopamine levels that remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back down to baseline. So you never have to do that dopamine deficit state because you paid for your dopamine up front. Now, here's the big caveat, and this is really important, especially for someone like you and also for your listeners. If you press on the pain side of the balance too hard and too fast, you essentially turn that painful endeavor into an intoxicant. If you think of, for example, people who cut on themselves, what happens is they immediately get a huge release of endogenous opioids that basically kind of breaks the system, so that subsequent cuts have to be much deeper, but very quickly they reach a threshold where the body just can't respond. It's overloaded. So now you've essentially taken something that's healthy and adaptive, which is doing things that are hard or doing things that are painful, and you've turned it into something that's unhealthy because you pressed too hard and too fast on the pain side of the balance. And where this comes in, again, for potentially for you and your listeners, but also for all of us in the modern age, is the problem of workaholism, right? Where we're now constantly pressing on the pain side of the balance. You know, our to-do list becomes our drug, and we're not able to let it go. It becomes our major defense mechanism, our major strategy. Or worse yet, we're pressing hard on the pain side of the balance, but instead of letting our bodies physiologically respond by naturally tilting to the side of pleasure, what we're doing is at the end of a hard working day, we're going out and getting drunk. So we're going pain, pleasure, pain, pleasure. And that kind of tweaking is very, very hard on our system. It literally releases stress or our own endogenous adrenaline or stress hormone. So that's not good either. What we're looking for is, if you're going to use intoxicants, use them rarely and intermittently. Leave enough time in between for the gremlins to hop off the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. And don't use really potent intoxicants. And likewise with pain, depending upon your fitness level and where you are, don't go out and like run a marathon if you've never run before.
And what do you think are the fallacies or the paradigms, if you will, that are begging for someone like you to disrupt right now?
Well, so much of, let's take nutritional advice, is based on falsehoods that have existed for over 100 years. And they just keep being repeated and repeated without looking at current available evidence. Let me just give you one example, which ties into the current book, The Energy Paradox. There are a number of noted authors who are MDs who have actually never laid hand on a patient, have never practiced medicine, and have spouted their party line for 30 years without ever changing any recommendation of what they said. Now, 30 years is a long time in medicine and nutrition. I'm one of the few authors, nutritionists who have a medical practice. I see patients, believe it or not, 6 days a week, even Saturdays and Sundays. And that shocks most people because some of my compatriots who are very famous say, "What are you doing seeing patients? How stupid. You got better things to do." Well, it's called the practice of medicine because, believe it or not, you practice and you learn from your patients. And I've dedicated a number of my books to my patients because they've taught me things. So getting back to the subject, for instance, the human microbiome wasn't even known about until about 12 years ago. We had no idea that there were 100 trillion bugs, bacteria, fungi living inside of our gut. And we just thought our intestines were some kind of hollow tube that we processed food through, and whatever we didn't eat came out the rear end. We now know, and the energy paradox is really all about that this community of bacteria probably affects everything that's ever going to happen to us. We know that it affects our emotions, the way we think. It affects any disease process that's going to happen to us. And yet there are still people who act as if this knowledge isn't important and just continue to say the same thing. A good friend of mine, David Perlmutter, who wrote Grain Brain, last year came out with the 5th year anniversary edition of Brain. And about, 30 or 40% of it was new, because when he wrote that book, the human microbiome was just beginning to understood. And he says, holy cow, I had to rewrite, half the book based on what we now know about, the microbiome. And he and I reminisce. I said, yeah, it's amazing. I came at this as a heart surgeon, and now realize that the reason heart disease exists is because of what happens in our gut. And you came at this from a brain neurologist standpoint, and you now know that most of what happens in the brain is because of the gut. And I said, we both go, Hippocrates was right. All disease begins in the gut. So and that just gives you an example. If you don't learn and then don't tell people that what you said, like what I said in my first book 16 years ago, a lot of that doesn't apply anymore, because I went, oh my gosh, I guess I didn't know that when I wrote that book, and now I know that. So I'm going to say, I made a mistake. I've learned something new that changed my mind. In fact, I was on a podcast yesterday, and the host said, you're one of those guys who says, I changed my mind. I learned something new. I don't, this is not true. And they said, that's so rare that someone would actually say, hey, I learned something.
But help the person who's maybe like a 1, a 2, or a 3, and this is new to them, like microbiome. I've heard of it. I don't really know why it matters or why it's important. Can you give it some context in terms of like the gravitas of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, sure. I had former FDA Commissioner David Kessler on my podcast, Dr. Gundry podcast last year. And he and I were reminiscing that when he and I were in medical school, we literally thought the gut was a hollow tube where you had some enzymes that broke down carbohydrates and proteins and fats, and you absorbed them. And then what was left over was pooped out, and that was about it. And he said, we had no idea that probably the most important part of us was in there as basically a tropical rainforest that we now know controls almost everything that happens to us. And so and this is all in the energy paradox. So most people by now have heard of probiotics. Those are, let's call them friendly bacteria. They're in yogurts and kombucha and sauerkraut, and they're important. But we're now beginning to realize that these probiotics, these friendly bacteria, have specific tastes and wants in terms of the food they want to eat to sustain them. And we're beginning to understand that those particular foods are vitally important to feed these guys because of what these guys are going to do for us. So those are called prebiotics. And so prebiotics in general are fiber. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of fiber, and most of the fiber that people think is what they should be eating is completely wrong. But fiber is eaten by the probiotics. Now, what's really exciting, and this is the frontier of the microbiome, is that these bacteria actually produce a language, a communication system that they communicate to our brain, they communicate to our mitochondria, which are the energy producing organelles in all of our cells. And these are called postbiotics. So, and it gets really confusing. Okay, so you got probiotics, the friendly bugs. You got prebiotics, the fiber that feeds the friendly bugs. And when the friendly bugs eat what they want to eat, they produce postbiotics. That is literally a language, a true language of communication. And we conjecture that this existed. We said, there's text messages going back and forth between the microbiome and us. We just know they're there. We've never, they're there, but we don't know what it is. Well, when this was discovered, when postbiotics, this language was discovered, to me, it was like breaking the Enigma code in World War II, the German code. And, once we understood that code, then you knew where the German bombers were heading, what the heck, and it really saved Britain. So we now understand the language that this 5 pounds of crap sitting in our gut is actually in control of most everything that happens to us. And the point of the book is I can absolutely guarantee you that they're in control of our energy levels, but it's far beyond that. So you're right. This is what we now know, is that Hippocrates somehow 2,500 years ago was right, that all disease begins in the gut. And I've paraphrased Hippocrates to say, all disease begins in a leaky gut. And we can get into that if you want, because that, it turns out, is the ultimate final frontier.
Pragmatically, in the course of a day-to-day life, I go through a lot. Like I wake up and I need energy to get out of bed, right? So energy, that's one system that my biome is intertwined with. What are the different ways, in very like layman sort of prosaic terms, that my biome is affecting me daily in my life? You mentioned emotions, you mentioned energy. What other impacts does it have?
Well, your microbiome literally controls how much energy, ATP, you will produce during the day. We now know that if this microbiome is thriving, they literally tell your mitochondria, these little energy producing organelles, how much energy to produce. They basically say, hey, things are great down here in the engine room. We're firing on all cylinders. We don't see any problems. Go ahead, process, food into energy, and we got your back. If instead you've got a decimated microbiome, or even worse, if you have a microbiome that the good guys have been replaced by gang members, the gang members are busy down there, throwing rocks through windows, burning tires in the street. And like in the energy paradox, all of your cops, your armies are down in your gut fighting, a bunch of gang members, and this signal gets transmitted to your mitochondria that go, whoa, there's big trouble down below, and we need to cut back on energy production because we actually need to support our troops down in our gut until things are better. And we see this all the time with this epidemic of low energy right now. And people are eating plenty. I mean, this is not a low energy problem because we don't have enough to eat. That might have happened long ago, but that's not our problem. But people are exhausted. And it's attributed to, Jeff, you're a busy entrepreneur. You've got 12 businesses simultaneously running. You're doing a podcast. You got 2 kids. No wonder you're exhausted. Well, apparently nobody told that to primitive hunter-gatherers, like the Hadzas. And if we get to it, I love this story from the book about comparing the energy production by a Hadza, this tribe in Tanzania, to desk workers. And anyhow, nobody ever talked about being tired or lack of energy. In fact, some of these cultures have no word for being tired.
So what is then, in a nutshell, and forgive those of us who haven't read the book,
it's okay.
What is the energy paradox?
Subtitle is When Your Get Up and Go Has Got Up and Gone. And the problem is we consume huge amounts of energy producing foods.
Right.
In fact, we're chewing on an energy bar, every 3 or 4 hours to get more energy. And the paradox is, part of the problem is those energy producing foods actually sap our energy. And that's the other kind of piece of the book. Back when our grandparents were living, it sounds trite, but they ate whole foods. And believe it or not, they ate whole foods whole. They would have a sweet potato and it would be whole. They did not have a sweet potato chip. Right. If they were going to eat cassava, they ate cassava whole, baked. They didn't have cassava tortillas. If they were going to have some protein, well, they'd have an egg, or they'd have a piece of beef, or they'd have a piece of chicken. But they couldn't conceive of, well, I'm going to have a whey protein isolate bar, and that's my source of protein. Now, why is that important? Because when you eat whole foods, it takes a really long time to break this food down into sugars, amino acids from protein, and free fatty acids from fat. And it's a long process. And as I talk about in the book, what happens normally is sugars get broken down first, and those arrive at our mitochondria to produce energy, and we're just fine, mitochondria work. Then a few hours later, the proteins are broken down, and then amino acids arrive at the mitochondria. The mitochondria are done with the sugars, the glucose, and they go, okay, good. Now we got these, amino acids to process into energy. And then several hours down the line, the fats arrive. And okay, now it's time to work on the fats. What happens now is that 60 to 80% of all the food we eat is processed and ultra processed. So now simultaneously, when we eat that energy bar or we eat fast food, a lot of sugar, a lot of protein that's been broken down already, and a lot of fats that have been broken down already arrive at our mitochondria, slamming into it. And it's just like, I live in the Los Angeles area. It's like rush hour on the 405. And what happens with all that traffic converging to produce energy, everything grinds to a stop. And that's why so many of us, 2:00 in the afternoon, after our quick meal at lunch, our fast meal, we're ready to put our head down. And then we need, a giant shot of, triple espresso to wake up, or we reach for an energy bar. And so we just continue to compound the problem. The other thing that's fascinating in our lifestyle that people are unaware, and this is work from Sachin Panda in San Diego, the average American now is eating food for 16 hours a day, from literally the minute they get up to literally the time they go to sleep. And that's so atypical for what anybody ever used to do. In fact, people don't know that breakfast is a modern invention. Nobody ate breakfast until the late 1800s when the Industrial Revolution started. And workers, men, were sent off to factories very early in the morning. And there were no work breaks, there was no lunch break, and they came home late at night. So the wives made breakfast for the men before they left, because they would have to go all day before they ate again. And that actually caught on, and thanks to the Kellogg's Corn Flakes Company in 1906, we were convinced from a massive advertising campaign that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, when in fact it's the least important meal of the day.
What time do you recommend, or maybe a better question is, how long after waking do you typically recommend somebody should it's time to eat?
Great question. So breakfast means break fast.
Right.
And we now know that the longer we go from the time we stop eating at night to the time we start eating the next day impacts, believe it or not, our ability to make energy properly, impacts not only our lifespan, but probably more importantly, our health span, how many years we're going to be healthy. Mm-hmm. And that's been worked out very well in both human and animal studies. And probably the perfect window of eating is probably about a 6-hour eating window. What does that mean? You have break fast at noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you finish dinner at 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And you can move those windows. You want to have break fast at 10. Okay, you finish dinner at 4, for instance. And the book actually goes through, okay, that sounds intimidating, and it is for most people. We take you, we hold your hand, and we start you just changing 1 hour a day each week for 6 weeks to get to that. And then it becomes really easy. Most people who've read my books know that I'm now entering my 22nd year of, from January through June every year, I eat all my calories in a 2-hour window from 4 to 6 o'clock at night. And so 22 out of 24 hours I'm fasting, and busy clinical practice, see patients all day long, don't get hungry, don't get tired, my brain doesn't stop functioning. And it's actually proven in animal studies to be pretty smart.
Why only six months of the year then?
I'm glad you asked me that question. Somebody else challenged me. So this year, I actually started in September doing this. But why? Because it turns out if you follow hunter-gatherers or you follow ancient humans, which was my research in college, great apes only gain weight in the summer and fall during fruit season. And they put on weight by eating fruit.
Wait, sorry, who gains weight?
Great apes. So
great apes. Okay,
gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, gibbons. They only gain weight during fruit season. And we actually carry their same gene that makes us store fat whenever we eat fructose, fruit sugar. And then they do that because the winter is either a dry season, a cold season, or a rainy season, and there's not much food. So when I first did this starting 22 years ago, I said, hey, I ought to follow my evolutionary design. So I purposely tend to gain weight in the summer and fall, and then I go back to not eating much during the winter, and the weight comes off during the winter. And it's kind of fun. This year, I went to Europe a lot this summer, and I put my weight on more than I wanted to. So I said, okay, I'm going to start now. And I've actually dropped about 15 pounds already. And for me, dropping weight is really easy. I used to be this big, giant, fat guy who was running 30 miles a week and going to the gym every day for an hour. Yeah, but that's another story.
You said something earlier that I want to come back to. You mentioned leaky gut. Why don't you just tell me what it means? I think I know what it means, but I'd rather hear it from a guy who knows he knows.
Okay. So if you had asked me what I thought about leaky gut maybe 18 years ago, I probably would have laughed you out of the room and said, hey, it's pseudoscience. It's not.
You would have said it's diarrhea.
So it's not pseudoscience. It turns out the lining of our gut is the same surface area as a tennis court inside of you and me. There's a tennis court in there. We have,
our gut, meaning does that start in our esophagus?
Yeah, from your mouth all the way down to your rear end.
Duodenum.
Yep. Small intestine, colon, the whole bit. So that whole area is the surface area of a tennis court. And it's basically our skin turned inside out. And that wall is actually only one cell thick. And one cell thick. Now, because it's only one cell thick, these cells are held together. You might be old enough to remember Red Rover, send Sally right over.
Right.
2 lines of kids, and they all locked arms, and you tried to break through. So these cells are locked arms, and with what are called tight junctions, and there won't be a test. Long story short, lectins, one of my favorite subjects, and we won't go there today, and other things can actually attach to the wall of the gut and flip a switch and break the tight junction. So now there's actually a gap in the wall of our gut. Now, here's what's fun. 80% of all of our white blood cells, our immune system, are on the other side of this wall. They're literally our border patrol. Why? Because bad things can come across. Bacteria can come across. Pieces of food can come across. Lectins can come across. And what we found with autoimmune disease, for instance, is that 100% of my patients who present with autoimmune disease have leaky gut. 100% of patients with depression have leaky gut. 100% of people with dementia have leaky gut. 100% of people with coronary artery disease have leaky gut. And that's why Hippocrates was right, but the paraphrase of Hippocrates, all disease begins in leaky gut. And the exciting news is, and this is what I do in my clinics, when you seal leaky gut, and that's what we do with all of our programs, and that's what we do in the books, the disease goes away. We have a 94% remission rate in any autoimmune disease by simply teaching people how to seal their gut.
80% of all illness is either caused or exacerbated by stress. And when I realized that, I thought, oh my gosh, I think this explains why sometimes there's physical illness that truly has a physical cause, and the other times it's something unresolved on a mental, emotional, social, spiritual level that's showing up in our physical body as headaches, as chronic insomnia, as all these other things, gut issues, that actually is something unresolved on a mental, emotional, social, spiritual level. And so I've spent the last 20 years helping people heal from burnout, realizing how little I knew about burnout, but everybody gets sent to me for burnout. And so now that's why I wrote a book. That's how I got here. I realized that, I went back in and told my colleagues, hey guys, stress causes or exacerbates more than 80% of all illness. So when our patients are stabilized in the hospital, why don't we ask them before they're discharged, what's at the root of their stress? And my colleagues said to me, just like you wouldn't order a test that you don't know what to do with the answer, why would you ask a question why would you order a test that you didn't know what to do with the result? Why would you ask a question that you didn't know what to do with the answer? And I thought, because people are depending on us, that's why. And so I've made that my mission for 2 decades. Just in a really simplistic way, our brain, if there's neuroscientists on, listening, they're not going to like what I'm going to say, but really on the most basic level, the function of the brain is to seek pleasure and avoid pain. If I just simplify it.
Yeah.
And so what happens is we can often be pretty reactive about things. We don't want to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, of doing something different, of changing behaviors. It's biologically wired into us to avoid that pain, right? And self-awareness, thank God podcasts have exploded and people are learning, and there's all these free ways to expand our perspective. But when I told you that whenever I think about solving a complex problem like burnout, I think of it, people say, oh, is burnout your fault? No, burnout's not your fault, and it's not a personal failure. It's a wake-up call telling you that the coping mechanisms, strategies, relationships, job you're in, whatever it is, you've outgrown it. And now it's time to use different ways of being for the next leg of the race. That's it. And so it's telling you you've exhausted all these probably amazing ways that you figured out how to keep it all going. And then when you burn out, it's like, oh, wake up call. I realized, 2 ice cold Mountain Dews plus a king size Snickers bar got me to 33, and overnight shifts, it wasn't going to get me to 53. Mm-hmm. Right. And so you start to, in the moments we are in crisis, here's what's beautiful about it. I've seen this so many thousands of times with my patients in the hospital. Someone has a heart attack, a stroke, a pneumonia, gets in an accident, whatever it is. In that moment, what matters to them becomes crystal clear. They know what they value. They know in what order they value it. They know what they've missed. It's actually what I consider many doctors engage with people at that moment and on a physical and intellectual level, like, hey, this is what's happening. Here's where the blockage was. Oh no. My big thing was that's a sacred moment because somebody just woke up to what they've been missing in their life. And I think we do that with any crisis. We lose someone unexpectedly. We go through a global pandemic. We have a breakdown in our health. We are at this point, like you described today, like you got on and you're like, I am really struggling today. I mean, how many other people are going to be like, he is speaking to me, you know? Mm-hmm. And you get to have community in it, but you also get to have healing in it. And so the question is, right? How can we, sort through that when it's us? And how do we do what we need to get what we need to? And I say, know where you're headed and who. Now, if people want to expand their perspective, they should be coming here, right? If they want to hear authenticity, if they want to feel connected to a human who's going to tell you where he really is right now, it's right here, right? If you're in an emergency, you're heading to the ER and you're grateful for it, right? So we just got to know like what works where and what do we use when? Because if we're abusing a system, we're not doing preventative care, we're not taking care of ourselves, and then we use the ER as the backup, yeah, someone's going to make money for that. You bet. What is burnout? Burnout is a triad. This is how it's defined. Physical, mental, emotional exhaustion. Exhaustion is the key. But it's not short-term exhaustion. It's you've been adjusting for months and years. Your physiology you've been using, take a glass of wine after work to take the edge off, and maybe now it's 3 glasses, right? Like this has been progressing for a while. You get up in the morning and it used to be, hey, I just need to grab a cup of coffee. Now it's like, make it a double, right? So there's all these ways that you've been changing over time. Your heart, your blood pressure, all these things have been adjusting. Now, when I look at entrepreneurs, sometimes I look at in their 20s and 30s, they have blood pressures of people in their 70s. Okay. So there's a level of how we drive ourselves. What I want people to know is, I want to know whose measure of success you're following. Because from the moment we're born, we need other people and we are wired to need to belong. And so if you're bought into the mental co-creation we have in the world, that's faster is better, do more with less, profit over people, success requires struggle, all of these beliefs, if you're wired into that, you're going to be on a treadmill moving really fast and you're not even taking your biology into account. You're on the world's idea of what success looks like. IPO, going public, cashing out of your business. I don't know what it is, but you want to ask yourself, are these my goals, or have I just gone into this whole societal belief of what success is? What is your mission? And hold on to that is what I'd say. So exhaustion. Now you've been exhausted for a while. You've been coping using these mechanisms. Your body's been coping. And then something comes in that's like a undertow, cynicism. It's that thought in your mind that just kind of creeps in and goes, doesn't matter how hard I work, I'm never going to really make a difference here. It's when you start to undermine your own exhaustion by not believing anymore. And sometimes you might even feel isolated from others, but you don't have the energy to engage. So you socially distance yourself, even though you're lonely. And lastly, you become ineffective. And that was me that day where the nurse is asking me, I'm asking her the same question over and over again. So exhaustion, cynicism, some depersonalization, distancing, and ineffectiveness. That's the definition of burnout. There's phases you go through. The first phase of burnout is in the alarm phase, where you jump on a treadmill and you're kind of working really fast because you got new funding, you got a new round, right? Whatever's going on. Well, if you stay on that treadmill and even turn up the speed, our biology is not meant for that. You move into something called chronic adaptation, where now you're using every strategy possible and you're hanging on. Then one more thing happens and you go sliding down the slippery slope of burnout to ineffectiveness and exhaustion. So there's 3, the triad of burnout, exhaustion, cynicism, and ineffectiveness. And there's 3 phases you go through. The alarm phase, which the body can handle. You keep on that too long, chronic adaptation, and then exhaustion.
If let's say you come up with, and maybe you already have, this is the perfect system to not get burned out for an individual. Is that system even doable in a world where other people are not also have not also agreed to participate in that system?
Well, what I'd say is my goal has never been not to burn out. I have for 20 years, I have investigated myself, investigated human behavior, treated tens of thousands of patients and physicians and healthcare systems and corporate environments, organizations. I don't know that I would tell you, I would tell you that I'm an all or none person. When I do something, I go all in. I want it to be excellent. I value excellence. I think what's happened over these 20 years is that I recognize that pattern in myself sooner and sooner. And when I fall off, because I just launched a book, I fell off launching a book on burnout. And when I fell off the horse, I recognized right away what was happening, and I recalibrated, made changes, used the tools that I teach, and got right back on. So to me, it's not about never experiencing it. It's about me knowing myself well enough that I pick up the signs really early and I can recalibrate. And so I don't know that there'll be a time that I don't, when I get passionate about things, it takes me over emotionally. And then I'm like, let's do that. That's going to be amazing. It's going to make such a big impact. I don't ever want to lose that part of me.
Yeah.
But that also sometimes has me overestimating what I am capable of, and that I do need to ask for help. And so I've learned these things about myself. Sometimes I pick the wrong partners and I find myself doing everything, feeling resentful. And I'm like, oh, net energy drain, Neha. Now I pick it up just like that. And I'm like, okay, now we're going from, the way I say it is from burned out to fully charged at work and in life. And as soon as I'm off the dark green into the yellow, I'm like, ding, 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 ding. New choices. Where's the leak in energy? Rerouting. So my thought is that as an adventurer, as an entrepreneur in life, what's so cool about that is you're walking into the unknown over and over and over again. And how cool that you have the self-trust to walk in even when it's messy, even when you're zigging and other people are zagging. Especially when that's happening. And then it's about what are the regrounding? How quickly can you figure out where you're losing energy and what you need to do to recalibrate? And so I think what I'd say is I learned at the bedside in my 20s. Everyone was like in Europe and backpacking and, doing all sorts of fun, cool stuff. I was sitting at the bedside of people who were dying. And as a 20-something-year-old doctor, they were speaking to me about what actually mattered. I think I got the secret to the end of the game. And what I learned was the money we chase, the titles we chase, the cars, the neighborhood, the people, the fame, the likes, like none of it matters. When everything ends, they talk to you about a couple things. Number one, was I loved? Number two, did I love well? Number three, did I make an impact? And if so, what kind of an impact? And number four, do I have any regrets? And those regrets were not about things that they tried and failed. They never spoke about those. They spoke about what they did not have the courage to try. When their fear and their own selves stopped them from the courage to take a risk. And what I really appreciate about you is it can be a hard day and people can be zagging while you're zigging. And you're going to get up and you're going to walk in and you're going to walk into the unknown of that frustration, of that discomfort, of that overwhelm. And you're going to do it again. And you're going to figure out how to get back on that horse. And so I would not say that I've figured out the secret to it, but I will tell you, when you have the self-awareness, when you understand your own body's physiology, like throat constriction, stomach turning, how your body's talking to you early, when you can pick up the clues and the patterns early, you're going to have days like this. And it's going to be about Does your mind tell your body, oh, like this is awful, what is going on? Or like, I'll give you an example. I gained weight 15 pounds while I was writing this book. Now it's time to go on tour and I can't button up my favorite pants. Okay. And I'm like, oh my God, you're fat. Like, what are you doing? You're not even gonna look good in all the photography and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So this thought goes through my mind. I thought, wow. So Neha, you were busy drinking coconut milk chai. You were busy eating all sorts of sugar and things to write the book. Your body was so gracious that it expanded to absorb the stress you couldn't. And now you're beating it up. So now what I changed my mental talk was, thank you, body, for expanding to absorb the stress that I couldn't. As soon as I can, I'll take over. And I did. Like, it's kind of a miracle, but when we divide from ourselves, then we're in trouble. But if we're kind to ourselves, like for you, as you go through this feeling of overwhelm or frustration, the other piece on this is control. And when do yes, we want the world to work in a certain way and we're creating this whole system. And when it doesn't, who are we in those moments?
Yeah.
Because even that is when we can sometimes divide with others. And really what we need to do is kind of figure out where's that place to surrender and kind of move within us, right? That allows us to stay connected, forgive, surrender, like become the water around the rock, because we have our mission that is much bigger. We've got that inside us.
Hey there, it's Jeff. So real quick, I want to let you know about my text message community. I use text messages to provide unique value to the Unlock Your Potential community. These texts could just be random thoughts. It could be letting you be the first to know about an event I'm planning, maybe giving an update on a special I'm running or some free training that I host for my community. Anyway, just shoot me a text to get subscribed to the list. The number is 702-996-3926. Again, that is 702-996-3926. Let's get back to the podcast.
As an entrepreneur, I don't know if people realize this, Jeff, but 72% of entrepreneurs deal with mental health disorders. We just don't call it that. We call it stress, we call it frustration, and our solution to it is we got to grind it out and work harder. The harder we work, the more successful we become. It's actually a psychological disorder and a neurosis that we have in our brains, but we just tend to work harder. And problem is it also leads to the number one cause of death in the US for entrepreneurs, which is heart attacks and cardiovascular issues. So we've got to be careful of how we as entrepreneurs are dealing with stress as we move forward into this, the next few years, because I think it's going to be a challenge. But there's a difference between doing a business for the purpose of an outcome of income and doing a business that you're actually inspired by doing. There's a vast difference in the two, right? And when you're doing something, and I know this about you, because you love what you do, you're going to continue to do it. Mm-hmm. The problem is when you have entrepreneurs and business owners who are doing something for the outcome, which is just income, right? Mm-hmm. When it's just for money that you're doing something, it's going to actually deteriorate your health. It's actually going to increase your cortisol levels, make you gain weight. You're going to need alcohol. You're going to need sugars. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to need motivation to keep you going. But when you do something like yourself or myself, who's inspired by doing what we're doing, right? You don't have to force us. This energy is not manufactured. There's no coffee. There's no 5-hour shots of energy here. This is just real, right? That's a type of energy that comes from the inside, from what I call an inspired state. So an inspired entrepreneur is different than just an income-producing entrepreneur, right? If you're just grinding it out to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to tell you right now that your business is going to have struggles. If you're an inspired entrepreneur, more focused on the client on the other side, focused on what you're doing and how you help them, then what's going to happen is you're going to have your altruism of giving and their narcissism of receiving come together, and you're going to feel fulfillment in the transaction between the two. And that is not where you stop working. That's where you're going to feel more energized to continue to build, grow, just like you have over the course of your entrepreneurial career.
How do you approach people that are caught in the mentality of the chasing the outcome of income as their primary driver? Obviously that's a secondary driver. Like, you always want to make money, but if that's where their head is at and their heart is at, and it's wearing them out, where do you start with them?
Well, first thing I would tell anybody, and I always recommend, the first thing you got to do is you got to understand your true identity, your neurologic based identity, not something you just made up. Your identity and your values, your life already dictates. Your life already demonstrates your actual values. You just don't know how to make money with it, right? For example, right, we're in the education business. We're both in the education space, right? My number one value by far, my identity is a teacher. Like I love to speak and teach, and I'll help people to get healthier and live a life that's truly inspiring to them. That is my number one thing I love to do. And if I can help people get more of that, I'm jacked. And I have a process and a science to make it happen, not just something like I'm just going to motivate somebody just by yelling at them. That's not it, right? But we have a science to this. So if you're looking at it and saying, I'm just doing it for the money, or I'm just in that limbo state, first thing you got to figure out is what is your true identity and what are your real values. When you get that, then you're going to understand why you make decisions. I'll give you an example to make sense of this. I had a client one time. He's making a couple $100,000 a year, good income, for what he was doing. And he'd been in the business 22 years. He was a little bit burned out. And I said, look, you're fantastic at what you do. You're one of the best in your industry. A couple $100,000 a year, great, congratulations, it's amazing. I said, but the reality is that you have everyone telling you how to think. And everyone's telling you and teaching you this is how you're supposed to think. You're supposed to get up at 5 in the morning. You're supposed to get up at 2 and do all these affirmations. And you're supposed to do. The reality is this, is that when you're done trying to think like everybody else, you come to me and you find out, and I'm going to teach you why you think the way that you do. Because you think the way that you do for a specific reason designed for your specific brain. And when you figure that out, then the principle begins to change. Then the answers start showing up differently. Because now you're not trying to be somebody else and you can actually be authentic to who you are. And the first step of that is to discover your values and identity in that process. When you get that, you won't judge yourself. Like, for example, if I judge myself today for saying, you know what, I want to be a Baskin Robbins owner. I want to open a bunch of Baskin Robbins franchises. That's what I want to do. It would be so incongruent to my soul, to who I am, to what I am on the inside, right? I'm a health guy. Like, that's what I do. I'm a human performance guy. But let me go open a business giving people sugar and frozen treats so people can gain obesity. Like, it's so incongruent to who I am. But someone can sit and say, here's a business opportunity. You can make lots of money. I can get excited. And could I do it? Yes, but it's gonna burn me down. And I'm going to cause stress and anguish inside of myself because of it. Instead, if I opened, like a bunch of gyms, for example, I'd have a different response completely. There's all these programs, books, we've talked about confidence for thousands of years, but I'm going to say something, and this is really how it works. Confidence is a byproduct of loving yourself. It really is. Confidence is a byproduct of knowing who you are and being congruent with your daily actions to who you are. That's it. Because when you're in your highest value and your highest identity, confidence will exude off of you. Mm-hmm. You can't stop it inside of that. But if you're doing something that you're not great at, something that you don't value, something that that's not your identity, you're going to be weak and scared and intimidated, and you're going to judge yourself to everyone else who's better. If I went into a bakery and tried to bake a bunch of cupcakes, I would be extremely insecure, right? Extremely insecure. But if I went into a classroom and started talking about, self-inspired entrepreneurship, man, I could do that all day long. From a neurologic health basis, I could do that forever. And I would have complete certainty in who I am and what I'm saying. That's the secret to authenticity. It's actually defined. They did a scientific study, and they showed that someone was authentic when what they're saying is actually congruent with what they believe. And when those two things align, they're completely authentic. And the vibration, the frequency of the individual is at its highest level.
For most people, just having a job, a 9 to 5, like that grind is not leading to the promised land the way maybe they were told when they were in college, right? Like they're not, financially, even if it's just about money, it's like, you're probably not ever going to be able to retire. Even if you have a 6-figure job now, you're probably not gonna be able to retire comfortably. So there's a lot of people that are kind of rife for this conversation of like, what's the alternate path? And inevitably what they do, like you're saying, they go to a franchising trade show, or they go on franchise.com, or, they come to Entra. They start looking and they find all these different business opportunities, like a Baskin Robbins or a pest control franchise or a tutoring franchise. And I think what you and I are saying is it's not about finding the right opportunity. It's about finding what's congruent and what lights you up inside, and then finding a way to make money with that, or finding an opportunity that aligns with that. So how do you steer people? Like, what's your practical experience, if any, with trying to steer people in this direction? Because, you know, we both know the vast majority of people, they end up in business opportunities that statistically don't work out and that statistically don't make them happy, at least the first time. So like, how do we help people get it right the first time?
I think the number one thing, and I hate to sound like a broken record with it, but it's knowing your identity and knowing your values. When you know your values, you'll understand why you make the decisions you do. I'll give you an example of this, right? I'm going to use me as an example just as context, because I can only talk about myself. Well, actually, I'll use another one. I have a lady, I remember, I did my value determination process at one point, and I shared with her. She came to my seminar and she was sitting there and she's like, Dr. Trivedi, I don't need to do this work. I already know my values. It's God, family, business. I said, that's fantastic. I love that. I think that's the fact that you know that is amazing. But please do me a favor. Go ahead and just fill out the form. Anyways, if you know it, then this should reinforce it, everything you're saying. Right. And she said, yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So she goes and does it. And she's the last one done. And she's sitting in the back of the room, Jeff. And she's like, just her eyes down, and she has her hand on her head. And she's like, oh my God. And I'm like, what happened? And she's like, business, family, and God are not even in my top 5 values. I said, really? Tell me about that. She's like, first, it's something like, you know, hanging out with her friends. And then second was like watching TV. Third was, you know, taking care of her elderly mother or something like that. And it was completely different. And I said, so let me ask you a question. I said, how's your business? And she's like, what business? She's like, there's no business. Like, she's like, I have to work as a teacher and I'm pretending to be in business. And she goes, I haven't done anything in my business in the last 4 months, but I say I'm a business owner. And this is where I have a problem with a lot of these business opportunity things out there, right? Is that you're not in entrepreneurship if you're not making money, in my opinion. This is the way I look at it, right? And I said, so what about your family? And she's like, well, my mom. She was like, but I don't see my kids. And, you know, God. I said, what about spirituality? She goes, I haven't been to church in 7 years. I said, so what your life is real, your true values are your life demonstrates.
Right.
But we project these ideas of other people as to say this is what we are. And here's the kicker, is our judgment towards our values is the number one thing, in my opinion, that destroys your health because it causes you more stress. So the first thing you've got to do is you got to know what the actual values are. What's real for you? What do you get up in the morning and do and get excited to do? It's Tuesday. It's teaching day for me. So I get jacked up, excited for Tuesday teaching day. That's what I do.
Yeah.
And I'm excited about it. I'm sure that's the way you are. And every person, if you do what it is that excites you, that's your highest value on a day-to-day basis, you will move your brain to a place of order, organization, and balance, which will help your health and vitality and energy to skyrocket.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that a lot of us, our values, what we think our values are what we think they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
But really, there's something else that just are what they are.
That's right. We take on the word supposed to. As long as we say, my values are supposed to be this, that's somebody else's values. That's not your own.
Do you believe that every single person on earth has this place, this intersection of their values and their sort of their created identity and their calling as a thing to go do in the world? Or do you think there's some people that are meant to just work a job and, you know, trade time for money, and that's the best they should aspire to because they're not meant to be, you know, entrepreneurs?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So let me dive into it in this way. I don't want to presuppose that someone being an employee is not someone who's inspired.
Right.
And just because you're an entrepreneur doesn't mean that you're inspired either. So,
right.
Like I wouldn't sit and say that it's, you know, just because you're an entrepreneur, you're inspired. But I think the highest point is an inspired entrepreneur, right? Like that's what I would say. But yeah, absolutely. Here's what I'll tell you is that the brain is stuck in the amygdala. And so and if you can't see, if you can't rewire it, to see past that, to get clarity towards your prefrontal cortex, and where you get certainty and you get organization, order, foresight inside of your brain, you'll sit and say, I can't see it. But, and a big but is this, there's a process I do when I rewire the brain to actually rewire the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the prefrontal cortex, in all the entire brain. And when I do that, you actually get clarity on your mission. And when you do that, you understand why you're put here. Because every single person has, this is not my belief, it's just my organization of order in the brain. Because if we see it on the way, we create a teleologic approach of creativity and growth. If we see it in the way, we break ourselves down. So it's a choice of how we want to look at it. But if we sit and say and understand why what's happened to us helps us get us what we want, every person has a mission inside of it, has a reason inside of it. Now, if you're so stuck with your, what I call root experiences, your thinking, you will not move your brain to be able to see it. So a lot of people will sit and say, well, yeah, I don't know what it is, and I can't see it. But they do. They just haven't had their hand held through a process that shows them what it can. And when they see it, they get nothing but tears of gratitude. Their body heals, and their amazing clarity that they get in their life, and they start moving forward. I've seen people who are on the verge of suicide go out and create foundations after this. It's amazing.
So the word that you used is mission. Every single person does have a mission that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to make sure I'm getting this right.
Yeah.
Every single person has a mission that intrinsically derives from a combination of who they are, genetically, sort of at their core, but also their life experience.
Completely. You're absolutely right. Every person has that. You can have extrinsic motivation or intrinsic motivation. I think you need both. In all the research I've done, intrinsically, you've got to be able to want to serve. Extrinsically, you've got to be able to receive and experience the rewards of your service, right? That's why those that in entrepreneurship, there's another big challenge I promise you that entrepreneurs in your community are going through is their relationship with money.
Yeah.
And that is an animal on its own. And this is why I'd like to open this can of worms up, is that an entrepreneur who doesn't understand the value of money in its own from service is virtually on the brink of disaster, because you have to provide service, which is the altruistic, your intrinsic self, the mission part of yourself that you're putting forward in order to receive, which is the material, the money, the matter. And then what we do is we're able to merge those two to create into the world, because your business can't run without money. My business can't run without money, but we love to do what we love to do and serve humanity with it. But you need both components inside of a truly organized entrepreneurial business, as well as an entrepreneurial psychology, in my opinion. The number one cause of psychological disorder and stress in people's elderly age is financial. Number one cause is financial. Financial stress increases cortisol levels. Cortisol levels increase to weight, increases to heart issues, high blood pressure, diabetes. All these conditions come from an imbalanced psychology, but also when their finances and their business and their life is not in place. So I would not take away from you, brother, that you are not saving people, because you are. You're opening the door for people to have a financial future that they wouldn't have had before. So you are saving them from a life that they don't even see it yet, because here's the problem. We separate business and health as two separate things. And I'm saying they're not. They're one thing, and we've got to align them. If not, we're going to have more entrepreneurs sick and mental health disorders than ever before.
What do you feel like are the prerequisites? Like when we say we can't save everyone, but we can save anyone, what's the differentiator? Like, what are the prerequisites that puts them in the camp of people that are ready to have this amazing life?
I think first they got to ask the question. They got to be willing to question, number one. Number two, they've got to be willing to put value. And what I mean by that is they got to be willing to pay, because nobody wants anything for free. Nobody's going to do anything for free. And the more value you're willing to put on it, the more you're willing to pay for it, the more you're going to get the outcome on the other side. I can tell you that I used to do this work, and the same things I'm teaching people today that we charge thousands of dollars for, I was teaching for free, and I'd get nobody at my attendance in my seminars. Now we charge money, and we get thousands of them. And so money opens the door for people to really value what it is you have. So you got to be able to value it. And I think number three, and I think this is the hardest one people don't like to do, is they got to put in the work. It's not simple, right? That's why I love health and fitness, because it is a direct reflection of the work you put into it. You can't lie. You can't lie about your health and fitness. You just can't.
Yeah.
And you can lie about your money. You can lie. You can have Ferraris on loan for the day. You can put debt and all that stuff. But you can't lie about health and fitness. And you've got to do the work behind it. You really do. Longevity is a thing that's real. And, the studies are showing if you can live for the next 5 to 10 years, you'll be able to live an extra 40 to 50 years. It's amazing what they're doing with longevity and health, but we're going to have to take care of this together. I'll give you an example of this, right? Like we have all this stuff with mental health disorder. Mental health disorder is not a disorder. And I mean to be I say that in the most gentle, loving way because people are struggling and I'm not taking away from it. But it's not a psychological thing. 94% of the serotonin, which is the feel-good hormone, is made in your stomach. So if you're not taking care of your stomach and what you're putting into your stomach, then you're going to think like crap. So it's not just a mental thing. It's a mind-body thing. You need to be whole in order to lead your entrepreneurial business at the highest level. And if you think that, okay, I'm going to think a certain way, but I'm going to go eat McDonald's 3 times a day and go thrive, you've got a whole different animal coming your way. You've got to connect all pieces of the puzzle. That's why I love entrepreneurship. It's every piece of the puzzle has to work in harmony. And what you're doing is such an important component of that.
We're in many ways very difficult to be in relationship with over the long term because we have a really acute survival instinct. And our brain tends to be built a little bit more for war than for love. At least war will overtake love if we feel threatened.
Let me propose something. You tell me if you agree and if it gets to kind of what you're saying. That we all want to be in a place of love within our relationships, but the only way to stay in that place is to keep our experience from getting overridden by the fear-based systems in our brain and body.
Right, which is very hard to do, easier said than done. And that's where, under the hood, a psychobiological approach is looking at the science of that, looking at development, what people can and cannot do, either because the hardware isn't there or the software isn't there. And that is what makes up human beings' ability to rise above our basic primitive nature, which is Hulk smash, which is being opportunistic and selfish and self-centered, moody, fickle, and racist. That is our species. And so we have to rise above that and understand that, we have to plan for our devils, not our angels, because devils we are if we are under a lot of stress, distress, or if we are not brought up well. And so we're talking about a higher level of moral reasoning, of getting along with others by understanding the nature of being human.
What's the ultimate payoff of doing this kind of exploration and work?
The take home really is that all unions, free and fair unions of equals, that's what we're talking about in the Western world, at least, well, parts of the Western world, where the agreement is that you and I are coming together based on terms and conditions, not love, not emotion. Very hard to separate those two. And that, like other unions that focus on survival, or we want to win, or we want to make money, or we want to succeed, right? We have a shared sense of mission, a shared purpose, and a shared vision of where we're going. Couples are the only union that doesn't have that. We go into love relationships not thinking at all that this is a union that has to work together toward common goals. We have to have an idea of ourselves as to why we will exist in the long run as a twosome. Why do it? What's the point, right? And so without a shared purpose, without a shared vision, all unions will fray. All unions will sort of decompensate and become dissolved, because we need that in order to get along because of our differences. We tend to focus on differences, how we're different and how we disagree, rather than how we're the same and how we and where we do agree. That's consensus, that's leadership, that's being able to find a reason for unionizing, for an alliance, right? So as soon as any union loses its sense of self, a sense of purpose, it starts to feed on itself. In other words, people will fight. There will be civil war. There will be infighting in groups. There'll be fragmentation, tribalization, and we see that happening today. That's been our nature throughout the beginning of humankind, right? And so first things first, when you are going to be in a relationship, did you organize it? You're the creators of this relationship. That's a shared mythology. It doesn't actually exist in real life. It's in our heads. Fine. That means we have to have in our heads the same ideas, or we will fight, or we will not be able to work together. We have to make sure that we have a purpose beyond and above emotion, because emotion can get us into trouble. So we have to have a purpose-centered relationship. We do this or that because it's either good, we believe, best, we believe, or the right thing to do, we believe, even though it will possibly, likely be the hardest thing to do. So that's a higher level, like I said, of moral reasoning. It's a higher level of interpersonal relationship. I have to think of you at the same time I think of me, or you'll take me as an adversary. This is a problem with all of us. So we're talking in a couple, we're talking about a two-person psychological system of we and us. And the audience need only imagine if our inner legs were bound together like a three-legged race. But if I were to do that to you and your partner, with your permission, for a month, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. This system has to be fair and just and mutually sensitive. It has to move together or it doesn't move anywhere. Partners have to accept each other's differences and see that as a superpower and work together cooperatively and collaboratively, or they will not go anywhere, produce anything, solve any problem. Nothing will happen except war. And that's the big idea here, that all systems that are coupled or family or community have to have a central organizing purpose for being, with a vision or set of visions, to get people on board, and this flattens differences. Also, we have to have rules of engagement. We have to have governance, meaning you and I can't get along unless we give each other permission to govern each other, right? To legislate what we're going to do and never do, and then also permission to enforce that. Otherwise, it's the Wild West. And number two problem, and this is physiological, this is neurobiological, is the manner in which you and I will interact when one or both of us is under stress. That is a problem because most of us will revert to a one-person system of thinking, me, my, mine, and you. And that doesn't end well, right? We're no longer allies. So we have to learn how to talk to one another and how to deal with one another in order to circumvent this survival instinct, which, like I said, is always online and always sweeping for dangerous faces or threatening voices or words and phrases or gestures, and right? All of that is happening all the time. And so we have to be smarter than the average bear here in terms of understanding the nature, again, of our mind, all the mistakes that we all are making all the time without realizing it, and learn how to get along. And that has already been invented. Long ago, it's been invented. We have things in place to keep us from murdering, raping each other, right? And that is laws, that is principles, beliefs, that is community, that is, again, like I said, making sure that that we're existing in a society that is fair and just and mutually sensitive. That's the only thing that actually can survive.
First of all, I just got to say, I love this. I actually had, I don't know if this was an idea you proposed or just something I extracted, but like, I'm thinking about going home and saying to my wife, hey, I think that we should try, what if we took an entire day and tied our legs together and tried to coexist domestically for 16-hour waking interval or whatever a day is, tethered like that and just see what it does for us, to us, from us, against us. Like, let's just see. Because first of all, I mean, I don't know. It's like such a powerful metaphor.
Yes. Yes.
Have you ever had people actually try to do that for any like prolonged period of, I mean, like, I'm picturing like trying to help each other go to the bathroom and like squat together. And
yeah, squat together. You have to do everything together, which means you have to think as a two-person system, which does not dissolve the self. It is not codependency. It is interdependency. It is like people who are in the foxhole together in the military. It is like cop car partners. It is like an Olympic skating team, skating partnership. We're different. We're annoying as human beings. We're a burden as human beings. We're disappointing naturally, but we want the same thing, and we have to work together with our differences. Otherwise, we don't win. And the same thing goes for a couple. We survive together in a dangerous world that has no interest in us in the long run. It's a world that is indifferent, opportunistic, and unpredictable, right? And so you and I, by social contract, agree to have each other's backs at all time. We're going to be ardent supporters of each other. We're going to protect each other in public and private. We're going to do all of these things by social contract because the world will never do that. And so we do. And therefore, the sky's the limit. If we will actually work together, we can create and solve problems really easily and quickly if we're good at it, practice. And that's power. That's power. Two people can do things that one person cannot, right? It's a mini brain.
And two people can do things that 2 times one person cannot.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Like the 1 + 1 = 11,
right,
so to speak. Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with the brain. A lot of that has to do with understanding how the brain works and how the brain actually doesn't work. For instance, we think that we're good communicators. Communication on any given day, I can prove this, is terrible. Terrible. We're mostly misunderstanding each other much of the time. We're just approximating each other. But all you have to do is be a teacher, an instructor, a professor, and you'll find out how many people in your audience actually got what you said. And this is happening every day. We think our memory is good, and it's terrible. We'll fight to the death over memory, which is stupid, but we believe our memory is correct, never was, never will be. And we think our perception is as is. It is reality, yeah, subjectively, but that is not reality. And in reality, it's not objective, it's subjective. So, and that's changing all the time by our state of mind. Our state of mind changes our perceptions like a funhouse mirror. So we have all these errors that we make as human beings because we're very, very fancy and we can talk. And that gives us a sense that we are correct and the other person isn't. It's sort of the hubris of human beings. We have to know this because this is how we go to war. This is how we sue each other. This is how families break up. This is how kids leave and become estranged, all because of our hubris, pride, misunderstanding of how our minds really work and don't work. We never can be sure actually if we're right. Never. If you really understood how the brain works and what happens in real time, you can't, because the brain is operating in such a way that we're not mostly conscious. We're automatic. We're moving through the day with automatic memory that we've accumulated, which allows us to be energy conserved, but it also makes us a little dumb because we're moving through the day not realizing that we're making errors and making all sorts of errors in our relationships. Sometimes we get away with it, sometimes we don't, because we are handling a lot of things at once. We're not going to remember most things that are told to us, right? Like, please close the door. How come you never turn off the lights? How come you do this all the time, right? Because we're automatic. We're going to do it again and again because we don't use those resources for those things. We use them for fancier things that require critical thinking, which is highly energy expending. And that's not what we do. That's not what any animal does. nature is based on energy conservation and biology. And so we do the least amount necessary, which is why we get into trouble in love relationships, by the way. Right.
Are there other things that you find are sort of like cracks in the foundation that people are often approaching their relationship with, that it's like, I forget exactly what you said, but it's like you have to consider, like, will this ever really work in the long run if I do it this way? One of them is the idea that I have to care about them losing as much as I care about myself losing, because if they lose, really I lose. That's one. What are some others that you may have come across in your work that everybody might benefit from hearing?
Here's what's necessary for a secure functioning relationship. Secure functioning really means equality, fairness, justice, having the same things to gain, same things to lose. All right.
So you're not using the term secure specifically in reference to the attachment styles. You mean more broadly?
This is secure functioning refers to social contract theory.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you.
So these are social contracts we make with each other based on fairness and justice, but we have to be true blue in that we are on board. I cannot agree to something because you want it only. That will not work. I have to believe in it. You have to believe in it, or don't even bother. Right?
So these have to be mutual covenants, or else they don't exist.
Yes. And they have to be vetted actually properly. Why do you want this, Jeff? Convince me that you have a selfish need for this, because otherwise I'm not taking it, because I need to trust that you will do this when you least want to. And that will only happen if you yourself believe in it. You yourself feel that you have a personal selfish interest in this thing, right? Because we need, as animals, we need to make sure that we are protecting each other from each other, and we are pointing in the same direction. You cannot bullshit around this, right? Because our lives are at stake, our happiness is at stake. So this is a real thing, complicated by people being afraid that if they say what they want or they disagree, they will lose the gig. And that's the attachment system that's making them stick together, even though they shouldn't be together, right? This is a problem. A problem of biology, but also a problem of maturity. So what does it take in order to be in this kind of relationship you and I are talking about? I have to be able to tolerate pain. Full stop. If I can't tolerate pain and I've led a life of conflict avoidance and avoiding pain, I cannot get along in this way. I cannot be on a team of this kind. I have to be able to accept my losses and know my losses and be able to grieve them. Otherwise, I will be acting quite strangely, and I will want you to behave like me, avoid loss. And also, people who can't grieve tend to be very angry people. I have to be able to accept differences as they are, and that you are different from me. You are not me. You are not. You will never be me. I can influence you, you'll influence me, but I can't actually be you, right?
So it's like, I have to accept not just the differences, but the irreconcilability of the differences.
Yeah, the fact is that you have a different brain, a different background. You have you're predetermined by generations of culture. You're predetermined by your genetics, predetermined by the way you're raised. You're predetermined by your experiences. You know, all of these things. And you've lived on the planet as long as I have. So we have to come to where we can find agreement consciously. We can't just assume anything. So I have to accept differences and be able to work with them, or I will not be able to work with you. I won't. I have to be able to hold impulses. Because if I can't hold to an agreement that we've made, I can forget, but I've given you permission to remind me. When reminded, I have to cooperate. If I don't and cannot cooperate, I can't be on the team. I cannot do that because nobody can trust me. I could come in the middle of the night and hurt you because I can't control my impulses, or I will not be governed by you, right? So this is an adult, grown-up thing of accepting disappointment, accepting all people are disappointing, that we're different, and I have to know you. I have to work. I have to know how to operate you. Why? Because as human beings, we do not like that which we cannot operate, we cannot control. A baby that cries and has GERD perhaps, or colicky, but I can't settle my baby. I don't like the baby. I don't like the baby because I can't settle the baby, which can't settle me. And therefore I feel incompetent, right? The baby is not within my control. I don't like the car that I can't drive. I don't like it. It's too complicated. I don't like the computer. I don't get it, right? So we have to understand that it's a duty. It's part of the career. I have to know you and operate you. Otherwise, I'll be incompetent. I'll hurt you. And you will not feel that you're with someone who understands and can actually handle you. Going back to childhood, just as it might have been in childhood with parents. We have a duty. I have to know you. We are not family. We are not family. We are strangers forever, trying to get to know each other, and that's part of the excitement. That's part of the gig.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely gonna love this one. Check it out.
You're doing ridiculous stuff because you're human. Your experience was completely legitimate. You see, we all feel that about ourselves, that there's something wrong with us. So it makes it entirely normal to know that you're not normal.